Welcome to class 94, Understanding Death, the Most Important Event of Your Life. It's a very informal book in one sense. It's written kind of whimsically in places, particularly at the beginning, but it's meant to be taken seriously insofar as what I say in the very brief chapter 1, which is sort of an introduction, really, that, well, I quote from Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, as I recall, regarding her statement that death is such an important subject, and yet it's one that we hardly ever talk about. Of course, now that we have school shootings and so forth, we are talking about a lot more, likewise with the war. But insofar as our personal life is concerned, we don't talk about it much. I don't know if that's still true, but it was true when I wrote the book. There's an incident with a dear friend of mine when we were much younger. We were in our early 30s, and she was talking about growing older, and she said, well, if I ever get old, and of course, it's not an if, is it? So let me switch to the screen sharing, and we'll start. And I'm simply, as usual, going to go through the table of contents for each chapter and sort of give you a brief reflection on what was said. But before I do, if you want to buy this book, it's available through the Baha'i Publishing Trust, which published it in 2009. It has 311 pages and 13 chapters. It's available through the Baha'i Bookstore, which is the Baha'i Publishing Trust outlet. And here is the hyperlink for that. And then in Amazon, it's available in paperback and Kindle, ebooks, available through ebooks at the bookstore. So here is the hyperlink for that. The first chapter, The Art of Dying Gracefully, is dealing with the fact that each of us approach this important event in our life with from our own set of particular circumstances. And so I set out by calling this a safari or a quest in which we are trying to deal with what I call the elephant in the room, which is the fact that we are all mortal. And I start off the epigram to chapter 1 with the famous syllogism that man is mortal, Caius is a man, therefore Caius is mortal. And since we are all human beings, we too are mortal. Excuse me, someone is not muted. Please be sure that you're muted. So that's the quest of our safari, as I call it, questing for this elephant in the room. And so the mapping of the journey, which is the fact that we begin at conception, and then we have basically 3 stages in our life, which we've talked about before: the life in the womb, and the life in this physical preparation for the next stage of our lives, and then the 3rd stage of our life, which is the spiritual realm, though it too, no doubt, has various levels and various degrees and experiences of advancement. So why do I approach this from a Baha'i point of view? And very simply because the Baha'i writings, unlike the authoritative text of many religions, deals with this question very forthrightly, very frankly, and very helpfully insofar as helping us deal with facing this question. It's not all felicitous in the description. It talks about the fact that, of course, if we have rejected in our efforts to develop spiritual attributes, then our passing to the next stage of our life may not be, at least at the initial stage, such a happy experience. But it does deal directly with the fact that the concepts of heaven and hell are metaphorical and represent proximity or remote proximity to God or remoteness from God. They are not literal experiences or literal places, because, first of all, as the Baha'i writings say very logically, how can there be a place in the realm of the placeless? That by definition, the metaphysical reality has no place, nor time, nor other aspects of gender, our bodies, and so on. So the life on death row is meant to be a humorous look at this, in the sense that we talk about death row, of course, as a most grievous kind of situation that those who have been sentenced to death experience. And yet we are all on death row, aren't we? Whether we are active or passive at this stage of our lives, we're all, in some sense, preparing for that ultimate event and defining event of our life. And of course, there's the old Greek axiom that count no man happy until he has died, because even the most successful and prosperous individual may, in the end, have a very grievous passing and so forth. This is particularly appropriate, for example, in studying King Lear, but let me not get into that. So that's a brief introduction to why we are approaching this subject, because it's one that applies to all of us. And because from a Baha'i perspective, because the Baha'i writings give us very specific answers to our very important questions. The second chapter is a kind of, I hope, it was fun to write, a dialogue among three triplets who are in a womb and are talking about their experience as they grow and as they start realizing their own development and so on. And of course, they see the womb as reality. And that's why I call it Plato's womb, because it's sort of an analogy, if you will, to the shadowy recesses of the cave in Plato's allegory of the cave. And so in the case of these fetuses who are in this fictional dialogue able to converse with one another and speculate about what they're feeling, what they're experiencing, they're kind of delighted with their own growth, but then they start worrying about this process. And so this is the story of the Sullivan boys, I call them. And the parents are part of the dialogue because they discovered that she is pregnant, and they've discovered that they're triplets. And so what they do after the boys are described floating and kicking and speculating about what will happen to them, or how much fun this is, but how rapidly they're changing, which is kind of unnerving to them, until they realize that space is getting kind of small for them as they get bigger. And they hear from outside the room various sorts of music, which you know of the Mozart effect, which is supposed to have a benign effect on the fetus, according to some evidence that was done many years ago of the music of Mozart as a soothing effect on the child. In any case, I know that many parents who talk to the child while they're still in utero and listen to them and feel them kick and so on. Well, but of course, this is back and forth from the point of view, switching from the parent's point of view to the point of view of the triplets in the womb. And so when the triplets hear the music, they wonder, wait a minute, where could that be coming from? And they speculate that maybe there's another world outside the world they live in. Well, needless to say, this is meant to be an allegorical description of how we are in this womb-like experience we are in this stage of our lives in the physical reality. Is there another world waiting for us? But at the time of their passing, if you will, out of their world of the womb in what we call the end days, which of course is meant to be ironic, paralleling the concept of the last judgment in religious eschatology. But in the case of the three Sullivan boys, as they disappear out through in our birth, each one sees the other go, and they presume that they have died and that they've disappeared, and they're terribly frightened. And of course, we know from our point of view that they're actually entering a real life that's much more important than this life. And of course, it's meant to be humorous, and yet at the same time, it offers, I hope, as I say, I enjoy doing it and I enjoy rereading it. So I presume other people have as well, that it offers us a good insight into if we could be outside this world looking at us, what would we say to ourselves to comfort us? And of course, Baha'u'llah does that for us, doesn't he? He tells us that, as we've read before, if we knew what awaited us, then we wouldn't be able to restrain ourselves from trying to attain it. The second chapter is another allegory or allegorical little tale of another willful fetus. Now, this is the story of a fetus that decides he doesn't want to be born, that he likes it where he is, and so on. And so you have this dialogue between the parents and the fetus. The parents trying to assure the fetus that that they have nothing but love to share, and that that it will be a wonderful experience, and that they were there to welcome him, and so on. And I then go into this dialogue and talk about this irony that where we talk about in the Baha'i writings this life as a prefatory experience preparing us to the next world. And so Baha'u'llah says, death is therefore a messenger of joy. And so it compares to this little story I've set up where the parents are trying to assure the fetus that passing out of that world of the womb into this world will not be death, but will be even more delightful than the world that the child is in. But the child is very cynical and doesn't want to be born, and so on. So that's how the whole thing is set up, with these two analogies in chapters 2 and 3, comparing the world of the womb to the physical reality. So death and human ontology, and the word ontology, of course, we've discussed before, has to do with what is the essential nature of human reality? What is the essence of the human being? And of course, as the Baha'i writings state, and as we have discussed often, that the nature of the human being is essentially a spiritual reality, the soul from which emanates all of our distinctly human capacities of will and reason and abstract thought and so on, the things that distinguish us from the animal kingdom. So what is human life? The human life, of course, is, as we've discussed many times before, is the metaphorical nature of our physical experience. It's distinct from animal life because we have the capacity to willfully change ourselves. Now, an animal can be changed dramatically, and as we see on all the videos that are available online, I'm particularly fond of one called The Dodo, which focuses primarily on rescue animals and how they're taken from this state of utter deprivation and near death and are brought back to life and revived and so on, and are trained and this. Well, this is true of human beings as well, but it is, while the human being can be assisted in this process, it's largely left up to the free will of the human being. So we are really responsible to a large extent for our own success in this process. The ghost in the human machine we discussed last time when we were talking about the nature of the human being insofar as the brain being an intermediary between the soul and the body, or between the spiritual essential reality that is the spiritual self and the way the spiritual self expresses itself by means of that intermediary, which through a common faculty enables the soul to express itself through human action. And this is the subtlety of the human will, that everything depends on our persistence in pursuing advancement. And it's subtle because it must be coupled with a process, and that is, we can want to stop smoking or do something much more important, that's getting rid of a negative thing, but to do something positive, say to get an education or to pursue a course of study in some other way, advance ourselves, improve ourselves, or improve the lot of others through our own assistance. And yet that will must be, as we've shown before, coupled with or followed by action, which then further informs our knowledge of what it is we wish to achieve. So this brings us to the problem of the new physics and old problems, which is simply talking about the fact that according to physics, most students of physics, there is no metaphysical reality. So how does physics or ontologists, how do they explain the human will and the human ability to think and to create? And we've discussed this before, and I won't go into it in great detail again, but the problem is very important, because if the brain is the source of our self and our consciousness and so forth, then how do you explain that all those neurons just spontaneously create consciousness and will? The Baha'i answer, of course, is that the source of the brain's operation, or the brain's capacity to translate thought into action, is the soul itself. So while a remarkable and the most remarkable creation in physical reality, the brain is merely a transceiver. I'll say merely, it is a very sophisticated transceiver of the human spirit. And this is the idea of the non-locality of the conscious self. And non-locality means that our conscious self is associating with the body, with the brain. But when the brain ceases to work, when it no longer has blood supply, or the body dies and so forth, or in an accident, or it's injured in some way, the self itself is not affected thereby. And we can discuss that at length in the Q&A if you want, but we've discussed it before as well, and that is proving this is a very important step in the advancement of the understanding of human nature, but also of reality in general, because of course, as Baha'is, we believe that this world is but a shadowy reflection of the real world, the spiritual world, and consequently the operation of the advancement of civilization and so on, the Baha'i belief is fostered by the advent of successive manifestations who, like teachers in the classroom, advance society and advance our collective understanding of ourselves and of reality in general. Well, it's possible, while it's you can prove the idea of progressive revelation in a number of ways, primarily by the fact that the manifestations are aware of each other, that they have an inherent knowledge without being taught by anyone else, and so forth. All of the things that are testified to by Baha'u'llah in the Kitab-i-Iqan. But the easier thing to prove is the non-locality of the self. And while there are a couple of things that have already been done by way of proving this. The one I mentioned last time were the near-death experiences, where you have someone in a clinically dead state of existence, and yet they can describe something that happens in another room, a conversation or something during that time, or even if they are clinically dead and they describe what the surgeon is saying or doing in that period, then that's why, as I said last time, the both oncologists and heart surgeons are some of the great sources of interesting detailed descriptions of people who have an NDE experience, a near-death experience. And so that does, for the people who experience it, as well as for those surgeons who, they become pretty convinced. And of course, they're scientists, very elite scientists, and they can, but many of them come to accept the fact that consciousness is non-local. How could we otherwise explain this capacity? Another one I won't go into, but I discuss it in great detail in one part of the book we discussed last time, the Close Connections, where I talk about an experiment that was done some years ago now, about 20 years ago, where people were able, through their conscious will, to make certain things happen. And this was a very elaborate experiment that was double blind and so forth. We can discuss that in the Q&A if you're interested. So I start off talking about, and again, much of this is autobiographical, tracing my own understanding of or interest in my own mortality. And I start with what I call the lamb white days, which are days of innocence. And that phrase comes from a poem. And I use a lot of poetry and quote from other writers in this. But for me, the lamb white days was the sort of paradisical part of my life, my first 10 years or so, which were spent first in Greensboro, North Carolina. And I always lived mostly in the woods. I love the woods. And so when we moved from Greensboro to Atlanta, my father's one job was to find a house that had woods near it. That was the main requirement. And he did, and they were wonderful woods. So we have then a section of this chapter called The Problem of Leaving Paradise. This is something that was very interesting my brother discovered, and I think I agree with what he found. The time in Greensboro was right after the Second World War. And this is when all the men were returning, and it was a very upbeat time. And it was a very sort of age of innocence. Now, innocent, of course, relative to my experience as a white middle-class child in a white middle-class neighborhood. So I was not aware of what other people might be experiencing on the other side of town. So it was an illusion for sure. and even more of one when we left. Because what my brother discovered after he grew up, he says he decided to make a trip back to Greensboro and find those who remained behind, who didn't leave that wonderful place and that wonderful time. And we had dreamed about it, that era and that time when the snows would come and we would all go sledding and the things we'd do in the woods and so on. It was an incredible neighborhood. The children were all roam free because everybody, all the parents knew that somebody was looking after the kid, and there was no fear of anything. Well, what he found to his interest was that those who stayed behind had the same problem. They wanted to go back too, but they were there. What had happened was that as the decades had changed, that Greensboro was no longer this simple, idyllic place. It was hustling and bustling and growing even as Atlanta did. And so some had become alcoholics, which my brother attributed partly to this inability to capture, or having to live in a place where it was no longer like that and so on. But whether we have an idyllic childhood or a terrible childhood, we have to leave it. We have to leave it behind. We can't, and of course, what we have seen, or at least what I have witnessed from that time back in the 40s and as we come to this time, is that while much of it was illusory, that idyllic time and place, where we'd gather around the radio to listen to Charlie McCarthy or Edgar Bergen and Charlie McCarthy and so on. Life was simple, and all the dark parts of it we weren't aware of, even if they existed. And so what has happened is, even if it were illusory, even the parts of it that were real have dissipated and been blighted over the decades, so that now we can only recall little glimpses of what that was like in our present society. That's whatever was good about that is totally gone. And so we ultimately have to leave the paradise of childhood. And I'm talking about, in this whole chapter, I talk a lot about the romantic poets, such as Wordsworth, and others who, many of their poems are about this sense that the child has an insight. Now, some of them were Platonists and believe in a pre-existence, and that in the childhood stage, you are more in touch with the realm which you have left. That is, you existed in the spiritual realm, you're now born into this realm, and so on. But whether that was their reasoning or not, Wordsworth, as he like lines written above Tintern Abbey, he recalls the wonderful experiences and feelings and intuitions that he experienced as a child roaming through the lake country. So who wants to go home again? Once you realize that your job is not to stay in some idyllic place, but to grow, to develop, to test yourself, and so on, you realize that you not only can't go home again, but you really shouldn't want to. And so you have this sense of parting lovers, in that if you remember in the Seven Valleys, Baha'u'llah talks about, after the valley of search, you enter the valley of love, where you have a sense of the beloved and you fall in love and you're magnetically attracted to your beloved. And yet, he says, if you stay there, the eagle of love will claw you to pieces, that you don't want to stay there, that you want to go higher to a level of knowledge, of the knowledge of what is it that you're attracted to and why are you attracted to it. So you can see this with people, for example, who become Baha'is. They are drawn either to the Baha'is themselves, or to the writings, or to Baha'u'llah, or the beauty of the hidden words, or Abdul Baha's talks. And there is this great love at first. But then you can't just stay in that. You have to advance beyond that and study what it is that underlies this magnetism you feel. And of course, what underlies it is a rational description of what you're here for and what your goals should be. Once again, somebody is not muted. I'm getting some bumps in the background. Achilles' choice versus moral reserve. What is Achilles' choice? Achilles, of course, was a Greek hero in the Trojan War, which actually happened, though we don't know how much of what Homer describes in the Iliad is based on historical events. But one of the main heroes for the Greeks was Achilles. He was foolhardy and so on. But he had a choice given to him by, forget by whom, probably the gods or something, to be a hero, have a gloriously heroic life, but it would be short-lived, or to have an uneventful life, but live to old age. He chose the heroic life. So I set up in this chapter a discussion of what is more appropriate or more difficult, some sudden burst of heroic resolve, or a gradual daily attempt at changing yourself. And of course, well, I say of course, in my opinion, even though we do have great appreciation for what the early heroic figures of the Baha'i Faith, the martyrs, the dawnbreakers, experienced in giving up their lives, when we wonder how much they had been able to study the writings or anything, but they knew one thing. They knew what they believed, and they knew that it was true, and they wholeheartedly stepped into the fray when they were persecuted, and all they had to do, at least in some cases, was to renounce their faith, and they would be let go. They would not be, or to hide their faith, as Mirza Yahya did. But they didn't. And they are still, of course, being imprisoned this day because of their refusal to denounce their beliefs and to accept the beliefs being imposed upon them. So, old movies and old ideas. This is where I discuss, and I enjoyed this very much because I love the old movies. And the old movies, of course, stress that a lot of them were, I love the war movies because they made it seem like it was so much fun. I mean, it was like camping out with your buddies, only you got to shoot things, And while I had no desire to hurt anybody, the idea, I loved rifles, and I love the idea of being able to shoot at stuff. And of course, in the movies, there would always be one heroic person. One of my favorites was Audie Murphy, who actually was the most decorated soldier in World War II, and he became an actor, and he actually played in the story of his own life. And so I talk about how in the movies they don't get blown to bits. They get like a neat hole in their arm or something like that, and they tie a handkerchief around it, and they're okay, and they keep on fighting. But so if they die, it's a heroic death, and there's no dehumanizing kind of what should I say, blood and gore. That is the reality of war. And so you have, I call it dehumanizing the hero, because it makes them, as we know, people who have recently been into battle in Iraq and the other in Afghanistan and so on. None of them come back unchanged, and not for the better. That you can't see people blown to bits and not be ruined by it. And so I investigate or talk about the mindset of the hero. What must the hero do and feel in order to become heroic? And I talk about the appearance of the hero in fiction and the fact that it is just so inappropriate, or it was the kind of thing, as I say, that was I sort of worshipped as a child, and I had visions of myself doing heroic things, and I would daydream about this all the time, about saving people through some dramatic move or something. And it was a long time before I came to realize that that was not the way life is. And so it was not something that one should desire in the literal sense. And so the unsung heroic choices then are those that are made by, from a Baha'i point of view, people who like sacrifice comfort to go help others in another country, whether they do it to teach the Baha'i Faith or simply to as a part of some of the programs that are vested in other countries to help people build schools, raise crops, and so on. That these are the true heroes of our era. And of course, we've come to study them and learn about them more in the contemporary realm. So jumping the train in Nashville, what's that about? Well, this is where I get back to the autobiographical part, and I talk about the middle class, the white middle class train. And that was, in my day, we were all expected, those of us who were white middle class at my high school, you were expected to go directly from high school, go to college, choose your degree within the next year, get your degree, get a job, get married, have children, have a house, and then get another house that was better once you saved up your money, and so on. And so your life was just sort of planned for you like stops on a train track. And that's what I compare it to. So I jumped train in Nashville because I became a Baha'i, and that was not what was expected, because I was supposed to be in a fraternity and do all the fraternity stuff, but the Baha'i Faith dictates that you don't join secret societies, and I viewed the fraternities as secret societies. And while not everyone may feel that way about it, I felt that I was obliged to get out of that life, and so I spoke before the brothers at the fraternity meeting and told them that I'm glad they enjoyed this, but it wasn't for me. And so I got off this sort of predictable course of action. And I awoke to an alternative sort of dream, which was quite different in maybe not on externally, because I did go on to get 3 degrees and become a professor, but so I went back to Nashville and got those degrees. But the rest of my life was this is a new Mizán for a broken bump. I'll explain what that means. I decided that early on in my career as a professor that I really wanted to devote my writing and my thinking to Baha'i subjects. And that's how it changed. Now, what is this talking about? They called me Bumpy when I was little, Johnny Bump, because I was always falling down, not just walking around or something, but I would like to climb trees and do daring sorts of things, because I believed I was a hero and that nothing could hurt me. And but lo and behold, I did get hurt a lot, and so that's why I was called Johnny Bump. And I still have the scars to show my bumpiness. So a Mizán means a standard, a balance. And so I chose a new standard for having been broken by this way of life that had been preached to me as the way to go, and had been borne out well by my own parents, because my father went with the retail credit company and stayed with them until he retired, and was well loved by all his fellow workers and so on. And so, I mean, he kind of lived the American dream about as well as it could be done. And he was a wonderful man, and my mother supported him in this. And so, and yet I discovered that wasn't what I wanted. And so my new Mizán was the Baha'i Faith. So I picked up the pieces, and even though it became a bumpy life at some points, a lot of points, I decided that my new choices were satisfying to me. And that choice was, even though I was a professor at a university, I would choose to focus my writing not on what I was supposed to, which was medieval literature, but on the Baha'i Faith. And that was the final test of that Mizán. So I talk this Friday evening at the fights has to do with a relationship I had with my father, where Friday night fights were sponsored by some beer company, I forget which. And beer used to look so good, I remember, on television, because this was before they passed the law that they couldn't show people drinking it. And so they'd show them, the bright golden colors of it and the fizziness of it, and these guys drinking down. I thought, oh boy, I can't wait till I can drink beer. But then I tasted it one time when I was a little kid. I was out in the field, and there was this beer bottle, and I thought, well, there's a little beer left in it, and I drank it, and there was the worst tasting stuff I'd ever put in my mouth, and I never drank beer. So, at any rate, on Friday night fights, Friday night was the boxing matches, people like Sugar Ray Robinson and Kid Gavilan and so on, and people you'll have never heard of. But my dad and I would sit together and watch the fights and so on. So we were very tight, very close. But I had promised my father I wouldn't become a Baha'i until I graduated from college, because he felt that I was just interested in the Baha'i faith because my brother had become a Baha'i. Well, I finally decided that I couldn't wait, because giving the preacher the word is an instance where I decided, well, I've got to go at least one more time. I was brought up as a Methodist, so I went to a Methodist church after I'd been studying the faith for 3 years, and I went to the Methodist church and heard the preacher, and I kind of wanted to stand up and say, no, that's not correct. You're interpreting that wrong. And I finally couldn't stand it, and I just had to leave. And I realized that I had to tell my father, I'm sorry. I'm kind of in between things here. I believe my beliefs are those of the Baha'i faith, and yet I'm really not a Methodist anymore. So I decided I had to tell Dad that I couldn't abide by my promise to him, and he said, that's okay. You don't have to cry about it. He patted me on the back. So I committed myself to the Baha'i life. I'm going to skip over a new method for teaching about God, though the method had to do with the logic of it. And then this passage here has to do with something that Winston Evans, who was a Baha'i incredible man, he was designated by the National Assembly as someone who would meet with important Baha'i theologians and people of import such as Billy Graham and others, and tell them about the Baha'i Faith. But he lived in Nashville, and he was in the community. And the last thing he said to me when he was on his way to pioneer somewhere where he deceased, he says, "John, always be a straight-thinking Baha'i." And I knew exactly what he meant because we had talked about it a lot. And what he meant was use the logic of the faith to uphold your choices, but don't waver from that. And it doesn't mean to be mindless about it, but he's talking about the covenant. So I'm going to skip over this. This has to do with a terrible experience I had when I was in Madrid as a student, and that you can read the book if you want to discover what that is and so on. But for the first time, I felt very much very close to what it would be like to die, and it frightened me. And so the examination of death became very important to me. And this watch out for falling rocks is an interesting little section in this chapter. You see these signs as you go along the mountain roads in North Georgia and North Carolina and so on. Watch for falling rocks, and in the book, as I say, I wondered what value is that, because once they fall, I presume they mean fallen, F-A-L-L-E-N, rocks, because if they're falling, there's not much you can do about it. They're going to hit you or they aren't. They won't. You can't speed up enough to escape the falling rocks. And it reminded me of other sort of insipid cautionary statements that we have to deal with in our lives about what to do and what not to do. And then I talk about the death of my father, which is a very helpful experience to me insofar as understanding death. So that's something you might find very moving if you haven't read this, is to read about how he died. He is a very noble man, and you might enjoy that. So the Art of Dying, going to try to finish up here, but the cat and I has to do with an experience I had where I saved this little cat. These kids were throwing it up and down a slide. It was a little kitten. And so I saved it from them, told them to get away, and I took the cat to the vet, and the vet, it had some disease, and the doctor gave the cat penicillin, and on the way home, it went into a seizure and just died in my hands. And for some reason, it touched a nerve, and while it doesn't sound very dramatic, I just sort of just let loose a flood of emotion. It just sort of made me realize I don't know, something about no matter what assurance you may have of the continuity of life, when you see it close up like that, whether it's a person or an animal or whatever, it's you understand it in a way that goes beyond theory. So artists, I talk about some of the artists who talk about death, who deal with death, such as "Do Not Go Gentle in that Good Night," that very famous poem by Dylan Thomas, and so many poets deal with death and dying. Luncheons with Leland. Leland was a Baha'i in our community. He had mesothelioma, the disease caused by, he worked in a car factory, and he contracted mesothelioma from I forget what it is, the particulates that are that cause that. But at any rate, so he was dying very slowly.
Asbestos.
Pardon?
Asbestos. Asbestos.
Oh, asbestos. Yes, thank you. Asbestos particulates. And he would come over and talk to Lucia and me about the fact that he was dying and what to expect and so on. And we talked very frankly about it. And he loved those talks, and we did too. And so I talk about the questions he asked and the information that he shared with us. Aging is a training technique we've talked about before, and that is that aging, on the one hand, is the diminishing of our powers, and yet it is, I think, a designed process whereby we are forced to prepare ourselves for the next world, because if we try to hang on to, and you see this happening so much in our society where people are shamed because, particularly Hollywood stars, of course, because how come you don't look as good as you did, 20 years ago? And they praise those who look half decent when they're in their 60s or 70s or 80s or whatever. And this, of course, just so ludicrous that they should be ashamed of getting old. And the fear of ALFs, an ALF is an assisted living facility. And I talk about a poem I wrote when I first came to Florida, and I saw these buildings that were dedicated to that. And now I understand the appeal of them, because you don't have to mow your lawn or so. But at any rate, I talk about how that kind of frightened me when I was younger, and I'd see that, and they looked like they were sort of factories or something. And so I talk about aging as a divinely ordained training technique, and that should be detachment ready or not read or not. That we're going to be detached. Of course, one of the great exhortations in the Baha'i writings is that we should strive for detachment. And of course, it means by that strive for detachment from worldly things and desires of this world and so on. And of course, the way we're designed is that we're going to get detached whether we are ready or not. Maybe tomorrow, maybe 10 years or 20 years from now, who knows? And finally, I deal with grieving. The idea that even the manifestations grieve, that grieving is appropriate, that this is not a sign of weakness. And even though we know that life continues, there are various reasons, legitimate reasons to grieve, and that we should grieve. And of course, we talk about Baha'u'llah grieving over his son, Mirza Mehdi, when he falls through the skylight, and the wonderful prayer he reveals for Mirza Mehdi, talking to God about what he has given up, and so on. Well, I end with talking about the value and the process of a Baha'i funeral, burial service, and why it's consoling, and the design of it. It's a rather remarkable process, a rather remarkable design that we have been given. Well, this was kind of scattered about, but the book is kind of scattered about, but it's fun. It's a fun read. And while this has not been a very exacting presentation, it maybe gives you a little idea of the kinds of thing the book covers. But it's particularly the first part I think you'll enjoy if you haven't read it. Or if you have read it, you might want to read it again. All right, friends.